Welcome to my lecture series on Middle East politics. I'm Dr. Bufano. For this lecture, we are going to be discussing state building in Turkey and Saudi Arabia and how it differed from other countries such as Iraq, Lebanon, and Jordan. This is going to be the 12th lecture in this series. So if you haven't watched those prior lectures, I highly recommend doing so. You'll better understand what I'm going to be talking about here. Let me just first share my screen with you here. All right. So last lecture, we talked a lot about state building, modern state building in the Middle East and how it emerged in the region. Now, one of the things you learned from last lecture is that a lot of the states in the region were built artificially by the Europeans, specifically the British and French. Countries like Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine were artificial creations that emerged after World War One. And these states have had a lot of problems with instability and conflict. Now, in contrast, the states we're going to talk about in the region today were not built by the Europeans, but were built from the ground up by indigenous forces through a process of warfare. And in fact, as you're going to find out, these states are some of the strongest in the region. Not all states were built by the Europeans. Not all states had their borders shaped by Europeans. There were also indigenous forces in the Middle East that played a great role in this. So we're going to understand these states. And specifically, we're going to compare two states, Turkey and Saudi Arabia. Now, at first glance, these states really, in many ways, can't be further apart from each other. There are on opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to questions like the place of religion in politics. Saudi Arabia is one of the most conservative states in the region, very traditional values oriented. In contrast, Turkey is one of the most progressive states in the region, and it has a long tradition of feminism, women's rights. So very different in that regards. But they do have one important thing in common. They both have very powerful states with a high degree of loyalty from a majority of the population. And they have been in contrast to the Sykes-Picot states, in contrast to Iraq and Lebanon, they've been very stable. And so we're going to discuss how these states emerged, why they emerged, and there's similarities and differences in the process, right? So not all states in the Middle East are weak. So we're going to look at these two states, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, to understand how they differ. And notice here that the kind of imagery, right, of these two states is a bit different. When we think of Turkey, we think of this kind of westernized republic. Whereas with Saudi Arabia, we think of a monarchy with very traditional Salafist Islamic values, so fundamentalist values. So we're going to talk a lot about both of these case studies. By the end of this lecture, you should understand their differences and similarities. So let's start with the case of state building in Turkey. Now, if you remember from last lecture, states are institutions that have a monopoly of violence over their territory, at least ideally, right? They're powerful governments. And so how did state building emerge in Turkey? Well, in the case of Turkey, it was built, this state, off the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. We learned in the last lecture that the Ottoman Empire, this massive empire that once stretched from North Africa to the heartlands of the Middle East, okay, collapsed due to this war. They lost this conflict to the British and French, and the British and French divided up the Arab lands of the Ottoman Empire amongst themselves. And the only territory that the Ottoman forces had control of after this war was in what we now know as Anatolia. Okay, this is now the heartland of the modern state of Turkey. What was left of those Ottoman forces, they're going to build this new state of Turkey. And those forces at the end of the war were led by a very famous officer named Mustafa Kemal. Now, a little bit about Mustafa Kemal. He was Turkish, spoke the Turkish language, born into a Turkish middle-class family. Specifically, he was born in what is now Greece, and he would eventually enter the Ottoman military. He would serve in various wars. So he fought in the Turkish war against the Italians over Libya, which the Ottoman Empire lost. He also fought in the Balkan Wars right before World War I. Once again, the Turks lost this war. And finally, finally, he fought in World War I as an officer. Once again, the Ottomans lost this war. So naturally, he was a bit pessimistic about the future of the Ottoman Sultanate. And on top of this as well, he was very much influenced by the Young Turks movement. Once again, something we talked about in a previous lecture. The Young Turks were secular, forward-thinking, modernizing. They wanted to transform the Ottoman Empire. And on top of it as well, they realized, or at least they believed, that the great problem of the Ottoman Empire was the existence of ethnic and religious diversity. They believed, the Young Turks, that the only way to create a modern state was by creating a modern national identity united around a single set of values. And for these Young Turks, it was about promoting a single language, the Turkish language, and promoting secularism. And so, eliminating religious influence from the states. And so Mustafa Kemal, very famous officer, supporter of the Young Turks, and eventually when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, he reorganized what was left of the Ottoman Empire under his control. And he is going to promote the creation of a new state called Turkey, hence his nickname Ataturk, which means father of the Turks. And so, since he was a Young Turk, since he was liberal and secular, the state he is going to build in Turkey after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire is going to be very liberal, very secular, pro-feminist, pro-separation of church and states. Now, it was not easy creating this new state. So when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, he's going to reorganize what's left of the Ottoman forces under his control. Right after the war, the Greeks right next door are going to try to take over vast swaths of Anatolia. And this includes what is now Istanbul, as well as the western coast of Anatolia. So the Greeks wanted control of this territory. On top of this as well, the French had some plans to take over parts of the eastern part of Anatolia as well. So Ataturk wanted to prevent this from happening. Him and his supporters, his middle-class, well-educated supporters, they wanted to kick these forces out of Anatolia and create a state for the Turkish-speaking peoples. And so for 3 years, they fought a war with Greece. It was very bloody. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. Millions of refugees were created in the process. In fact, there's still a lot of bad blood with the Greeks as a result of this. And so many Greeks in Anatolia, many Greek civilians were killed and were forced to leave the country to what is now the modern state of Greece. And many Turks in Greece were killed and forced to leave Greece for Anatolia. So what essentially happened here was ethnic cleansing. Lots of Turks and Greeks were killed. This was kind of similar to what happened with India and Pakistan, for example. This was an age in which nationalist sentiments were emerging. There was a lot of intolerance from minority groups. So lots of population transfers were happening in different parts of the world. And this includes Greece and Turkey. And so thus we get over 1 million refugees created. So the modern Turkish states was founded on bloodshed, and it was founded by the Turks themselves, the peoples of Anatolia. The state of Turkey was not created by the Europeans. It was created by the indigenous peoples led by this very famous founding father, Ataturk. And part of the reason what made Turkish nationalism so strong is that, like American nationalism, there is this sense of a founding, right? There's a founding father. There is a founding ideology, a founding ethos here that was missing in the mandates of Iraq and Lebanon and Jordan. And of course, there's a lot of pride here because the Turks won this war, right? So we get this Turkish pride that emerges after this conflict. And the treaty that gets signed, the Treaty of Lausanne, this was a city within Switzerland, right? So they go there, the Turks and the Greeks, they sign this agreement, they agree on their borders, and by 1923, Turkey becomes an independent state. So the state building here was done through warfare. And this here is Mustafa Kemal, otherwise known as Ataturk. Notice here, his kind of westernized appearance. He's wearing the suit and tie. He saw himself as a Western reformer. He felt that the problem of the Ottoman Empire was what he saw as its backwardness. The fact that it mixed religion and politics, the fact that it was this multi-ethnic empire without a common national identity, the fact that it was ruled by a sultan. He saw these massive problems. He wanted to create a republic, a modern republic based on Western values. So he was a forward-thinking reformer. And by the way, just to kind of visualize this war between Greece and Turkey, if you remember from a couple of lectures ago, Greece had gained independence from the Ottoman Empire in the 1820s following a revolution. And during the period right after World War I, Greece tried to take more territory by invading Western Anatolia, where there are a lot of Greek-speaking peoples, but Ataturk forced these peoples out of the region. Now, Ataturk, for his part, he's going to move the capital from Istanbul, otherwise known as Constantinople, to a new capital in the center of the country. So Turkey is going to gain its independence. And in the process of this, we're going to see the emergence of nation building here. So the Turkish Republic. Ataturk is going to build an entirely new system here. A new constitution is going to be created that is going to be a presidential system modeled off of the United States, a republic with separation of powers between a legislative, executive, and judicial branches. And it's going to be secular. So French-style law code. They're going to get rid of, the mixing of religion and politics here. In the process, the Ottoman Caliphate, that is the Ottoman Sultanate, is going to be abolished here. So no more monarchy. That is a thing of the past here in Ataturk's new country. So this is a westernized kind of system, forward thinking. It's going to abolish the monarchy here. Now, here's the thing with Ataturk, though. He felt that many people within this new state, Turkey, particularly people in rural areas that lacked an education, they weren't ready for a true democracy. He felt these people needed to be educated first in secular Western values. And so what he does is he creates a new political party called the Republican People's Party. And the goal of this party is to engage in mass education of the public, to create modern citizens that are secular thinking, forward thinking, that understand the modern sciences, that are literate in Turkish. So he creates this single party, and during his lifetime, it's going to be a dictatorship. And thus, no other parties are going to be allowed to win elections, only his Republican People's Party. And so his grand hope was that in the long-term future, eventually Turkey would democratize. But in the short term, we have this kind of a single-party secular dictatorship. So he promotes secularism here. One of the things he does is he shuts down the Islamic courts. No longer are there religious ulama that are interpreting the law. So we have secular style courts that get established here. And in fact, he takes this very far. He bans Sufi orders, these mystical orders, and he bans Islamist political parties. Anybody trying to promote the integration of religion and politics gets banned here. So really strong emphasis on the separation of religion and state. And this had numerous consequences. Number one, women's equality. So under Ataturk's republic, not only could men vote, but women could vote as well. In fact, universal suffrage is going to be enacted, the first country in the Islamic world to do so. In fact, they were so forward-thinking that they were actually a couple years before France. So they did this a few years before France in terms of allowing women the right to vote. And just to explain the timing of this with feminism, the United States had given the right for women to vote in 1919, right? So right after World War I. Now, why the timing of this? Well, during World War I, hundreds of thousands of men were sent off to fight in the war, and they needed women, countries in Europe, to be able to run the factories, to be able to run businesses. And so women are going to gain a tremendous amount of power during the war, and this led to increased pressure for women's rights. A lot of suffrage movements are going to emerge around this time period. And thus Ataturk, because he was forward-thinking, he saw himself as a westernizer, he wanted to copy these reforms being made in the West. Thus, we get the promotion of women's equality, such as the right to vote. He also abolishes polygamy. No longer can you marry multiple wives. So no more being able to marry four wives here. He promotes equality with education access. He integrates schools for men and women. And so thus women are going to receive an education. In fact, you're going to see here mandatory primary education. Finally, there's going to be equality in divorce inheritance. So he's going to make it so that it's relatively easy for women to be able to get a divorce and that there's equality when it comes to receiving inheritance from relatives. Now, other things that he did involving secularism here that are critical, he is going to destroy this notion of the people of the book, right? No more distinctions between religions. He's going to destroy the Ottoman Malay system, which treated monotheists such as Christians and Jews as second-class citizens. So no more special taxes like the jizya tax on Christians and Jews. No more distinctions in terms of how these groups are treated under the law. They are going to be treated equally. These reforms were fundamental, they were massive, and unlike the early attempts during the Tanzimat of the Ottoman reforms, they're going to stick here in Turkey. They're going to create a very secular political system here after the war. Now, other radical reforms that were made here. Now, previously, the Turkish language had been written with the Arabic script. And on top of that, within the Turkish language, there were a lot of foreign loan words. A little less than half the words, in fact, came from Arabic. There were lots of loan words from Farsi, from European languages like French and English. What he does here, and academics, that supported this, is they're going to restandardize the Turkish language. They're going to eliminate most of the foreign loan words. And so by the end of this period, only about 20% of the words in the Turkish language are going to be foreign loan words. The rest are going to have Turkish descent, right? So it's going to be a heavily Turkish-based language here. And on top of this as well, they're going to get rid of the Arabic script that was being used to write the language. They're going to replace it with the Latin-based script. So once again, kind of Western looking here. And in fact, they're going to get rid of the Islamic lunar calendar, and they're going to replace it with a Western solar calendar. So this was part of a general Westernization of the state. And in fact, Turkey is eventually, after World War II, they're going to join NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, this military alliance with the United States. So this was a very Westernized, forward-looking regime here. And on top of this, we as well here see a more powerful state that's going to emphasize economic developments. In order to industrialize this country after the war, so under the Ottomans, the economy was still based on agriculture. He is going to use what are called tariffs to protect domestic industry. He's going to put taxes on imports that are coming from Western countries and other countries throughout the globe in order to try to foster industrial development. In fact, some state-run industries are going to be created. There's also going to be private industries protected with tariffs. And he's going to enact these policies during the Great Depression. And so he was kind of like FDR here in terms of heavy state involvement in the economy, the establishment of social welfare programs, the establishment of mass education. So they're going to build schools throughout the country, primary schools. And within these schools, Turkish nationalism is going to be promoted. In fact, old languages that were not Turkish were banned in newspapers. They were banned in schools. And so thus, non-Turkish languages like Kurdish are going to be suppressed here. Now, because the Ottoman Empire had lost most of their lands, this new Turkish state, which consisted of Anatolia, had already consisted a majority of Turks. But there still existed linguistic minorities, the largest of which are people who speak the Kurdish language. Their language is going to be heavily suppressed. And so thus, the only part of this new country that's going to experience a lot of political instability after the 1920s is really the Kurdish region in the southeast. But for the rest of the country that was Turkish speaking, a lot of these reforms were welcomed. And because Because Anatolia and Istanbul was the heart of the Tanzimat reforms, the heart of these kind of defensive development and modernization efforts, the people in the cities in this new state are going to heavily support these reforms. Only peoples in the countryside are going to, particularly amongst those who are Islamists, are going to resist this heavily. So, for a lot of the elites in the cities, they're going to support Ataturk and his modernization efforts. Now, as you can see here, Ataturk had a lot of success when it came to economic development and modernization. Turkey is going to become one of the few countries in the region to have success with industrialization. Its economy is going to grow. The average person now earns approximately $20,000 a year per capita. Its cities are going to grow greatly. So this is a well-urbanized, well-industrialized country with a relative homogenization. Approximately over three-quarters of the population speaks the Turkish language. You can see where Turkish is spoken in Turkey here. So the only big minority language that is left is the Kurds, found in the southeast here, in the Taurus mountain ranges. So this is a relatively homogeneous country. Now, our other case study here, Saudi Arabia, which in many ways can't be more different from Turkey, yet also incredibly similar, as you're going to find out. Now, just a little bit of a background on Saudi Arabia here. Saudi Arabia is based in the Arabian Peninsula, okay, and its capital is in Riyadh. And it is today ruled by the Saudi monarchy, okay? The Saudis were a tribal confederation that ruled over Riyadh starting in the year 1727. And it was founded by Muhammad ibn Saud. So the Saud family dominates the state until this very day. And they were based in an oasis called Riyadh. Now, the Arabian Peninsula, just to give you some background here, is very different from Anatolia. Unlike Anatolia, which has a lot of good rain, agricultural lands, most of Saudi Arabia is desert. And in the middle of this desert is this oasis Riyadh, so it's got these underground wells that can support a relatively large population. This is where the Saudi monarchy is going to form. Now, here's the thing with Saudi Arabia. It wasn't ruled by the Ottoman or Qajar empires. It wasn't ruled as well by the Europeans. Before the discovery of oil, very recently in history, it was an economically underdeveloped region. It had an economy that was based on pastoralism, that is raising goats and sheep. It didn't have much of an economy. There was some long distance trade amongst some of the oases, but these towns and these oases were very small. The Bedouin of the region, the pastoralists, right? They raised goats and sheep. They did not have much in the way of wealth. And because it wasn't part of the Ottoman and Qajar empires, nor was it threatened by the Europeans had no interest in this region until much later with the discovery of oil. There was no incentives for development. So the Saudi monarchs did not engage in defensive developmentalism. They didn't build universities. They didn't invest in modern education. They didn't make any attempts to invest in modern industry. There was no attempt to modernize agriculture. There was no attempts to invest in a modern military. Consequently, there was also no mass urbanization. There was no social movement activity that emerged. There wasn't an emergence of a middle class that promoted either liberalism or even Islamism, right? So you don't have social movements that emerge at all in the 1800s. And on top of this as well, because the Saudis had this very conservative culture, they were opposed to what the Ottoman and Qajar empires were doing in the 1800s in terms of defensive developmentalism. So it remained a very poor region dominated by pastoralism. And this would not change until the discovery of oil in Saudi Arabia in 1938. Now, one of the things, of course, that is, paradoxically positive about this is that the Europeans are going to ignore this part of they're not going to try to colonize it. So here's Saudi Arabia on a map here, and this is Riyadh, the heartland of Saudi Arabia today. This is a region that consists mainly of desert. The Ottoman Empire and the Qajar empires were located to the north, and so while they were dealing with the challenges of European imperialism and defensive development, Saudi Arabia was not. And so this is what most of Saudi Arabia looks like, right? It's a desert, dry, doesn't have much in the way of rain, and it does have these scattered oases such as Riyadh and as well as Mecca and Medina. And so this is what the Saudi royal family looked like back in the late 19th and early 20th century. Notice these folks were not very wealthy, right? And so the main economic activity here was pastoralism, raising camels, goats, and sheep. And this is just kind of population distribution, just to show you how um, loosely populated this country is, right? It doesn't have a dense population. There aren't that many people per square mile here. You do have a couple, if you notice in red here, the darker red colors are where you do have more dense populations. Here in Riyadh, as well as in Mecca and Medina, we have some populations located here. And in today's world, because most of the oil is located in this region here to the east, the Hassa Qatif region, we do have some population concentrations. But as you notice, most of this country is not populated at all. It's mostly desert. In fact, the southeast is known as the empty quarter. So there's almost no people that live in most parts of this country. All right, state building. How was Saudi Arabia built? Well, it was founded, as I said, in 1727, but initially this was a very poor pre-modern state that didn't have much control over its territory. And it was based on very traditional religious values. So Sharia law was enforced. This was the law of the land, just like other pre-modern Islamic empires and tribal confederations. Now, an important story about Saudi Arabia here is the nature of its Sharia law. This was a Salafist state. In other words, it adopted a type of Islam that was fundamentalist and based on the founding traditions of the Prophet Muhammad and his companions. If you remember from a prior lecture, Salafists, okay, are people who believe in a simplified form of Islam where you focus on the five pillars, right? They are anti-Sufi, so they don't believe in mysticism and these kind of open-minded traditions, and they reject Shiism as well. So during the mid 18th century, Salafism became very popular in Saudi Arabia, and it was led by this movement called Wahhabism. And these Wahhabi preached Salafism. Now, Wahhabi themselves, this is a movement, or this was a group of religious scholars founded in the 18th century by Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab. And the Wahhabis basically as a movement kind of emerged in rejection to what was happening in the Ottoman Empire. They were against the Tanzimat reforms. They were against defensive developmentalism. They were against the spread of Western values to the Middle East. And thus, Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab, he was inspired by Salafism. He begins preaching this. And in 1744, the Saudi monarchy makes an alliance with these Wahhabi ulama. And these ulama actually had a group of fighters that supported them called the Ikhwan. So the Wahhabi make this strategic alliance with the monarchy. And so in exchange for recognizing Saudi rule, these Wahhabi ulama, these religious scholars, okay, get supported with patronage by the Saudi royal family. And so thus Saudi Arabia develops this very conservative form of Islam that lasts until this very day. So unlike Turkey, we see the development here of this very traditional religious state that rejects cultural modernization, that rejects women's equality, that rejects the separation of church and state, and it rejects as well religious equality. And so it's highly patriarchal, Saudi Arabia. In fact, today in Saudi Arabia, the majority of women wear what's called a niqab. A niqab, it covers the entire body except for the eyes. So I'm going to show you what this looks like in a picture in a second. So women, could not get an easy divorce like men could. Women up until 2017 could not drive in Saudi Arabia, for example. So this was a very highly patriarchal society dominated by men. Now, in the early stages of Saudi Arabia, it did not have stable borders like a pre-modern state. In fact, it went through these three periods of contraction and expansion from 1727 until the early 20th century. And the final period of expansion that would lead to the creation of the modern state and its borders took place between 1902 and 1933. So the modern state is not going to emerge until after this period when oil is discovered. Now, an important part of this third period of expansion is that it's going to lead to Saudi Arabia conquering Mecca and Medina. Now, in those three periods of expansion, Saudi Arabia got involved in a lot of wars with the Ottoman Empire over trying to conquer what is called the Hejaz region of Mecca and Medina. Now, the reason why this was important for the Saudis is that Mecca is the heartland of Islam, the place of pilgrimage. And the Wahhabi, they wanted control of it. So did the Ottoman Empire. Now, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1918, the overseers of Mecca and Medina, the Sharif Hussein and his family, they were busy fighting, okay, with the British, okay, against the Ottoman Empire, and their forces are going to end up mostly in Iraq and Jordan. And so the Saudis are going to take advantage of this. In 1925, they're going to invade Mecca and Medina and take control of the Hejaz region. And by 1933, the borders of Saudi Arabia are going to be set, right? So we're going to see by the end of this third period of expansion, the modern Saudi state emerge. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, why did the British or the French, why didn't they try to stop them? And the simple reason is they didn't care. For the British and French at this time, oil had yet to be discovered in Saudi Arabia, and it consisted mostly of desert. So for them, as long as the Saudis didn't try to attack the British or French mandates in the region, they left Saudi Arabia alone. Okay, so by 1933, the borders of the state get formed. In fact, they signed a treaty with the British agreeing on the borders of the Saudi state. And so this is just looking here, this map, we can see here the heartland of Saudi Arabia is in Riyadh. This region's known as the Nejd, and they're going to go and conquer Mecca and Medina and other regions from 1902 to 1933. So this is what it shares in common with Turkey. This was a state created by indigenous forces using warfare. Okay. But unlike Turkey, they didn't face stiff resistance from Europeans. Okay. They're going to face little resistance at all. And hence they didn't need a modern military that was well equipped to conquer this region. So they were left alone here. Now, state building and oil. Okay, so in many ways, the modern state of Saudi Arabia is going to emerge after this period, and it is due to the discovery of this very valuable resource. Oil was discovered by speculators in Saudi Arabia in 1938 in this region called Hassa and Qatif in Saudi Arabia and off the coast in the Persian Gulf. And they're going to discover a treasure trove of oil. We're talking about 1/4 of the world's oil reserves. So suddenly you have the Saudis, okay, this traditional monarchy, suddenly discovering a bunch of oil. I don't know if you've ever seen the, famous American TV show, The Beverly Hillbillies, but it's about these, poor folk in the United States that suddenly discover oil and then they move to Beverly Hills. And the kind of joke of that show is you get these kind of people with traditional values that suddenly come upon a lot of money and are interacting with these rich folk, right, that are in another part of the country that have a very different set of values. Well, it's very similar here with Saudi Arabia. You have these very traditional people, suddenly, boom, they discover a lot of oil and they now suddenly have this resource underneath their feet. Now, the Saudis didn't have the ability to take this oil out of the ground and export it. And so during World War II, so this is going to, be another big, massive war that's going to be very destructive for the world. The United States was looking for greater access to oil resources, and the U.S. was quickly becoming the new superpower of the world. And so they turned to the Saudis and say, hey, look, we can help you pull this oil out of the ground. And in exchange for allowing our oil companies in your country, we can protect your country, we can help build up your modern state and protect you from outside enemies. And so thus the United States makes this deal with Saudi Arabia. And they formed this joint oil company called Aramco, the Arabian American company. Okay, it was formed by what is now ExxonMobil and Saudi Arabia. So they formed this joint company. They agree to share the profits from the oil, and Aramco as well agrees to help Saudi Arabia build a modern infrastructure of roads, bridges, oil pipelines, and so on and so forth. So this company was established in 1941, in the middle of World War II. And as a result of this, Saudi Arabia is going to move from being this kind of pastoral economy where goats are raised to being an oil dependent economy. In fact, 90% of Saudi Arabia's economy today, approximately, is oil dependent. The only major source of revenue other than this is the Hajj, the pilgrimage. You have people from over the world visiting Mecca and Medina once a year. 10% of their economy comes from this. And so, using the profits from oil, the Saudis are going to build a modern state. They're going to build highways, airports, a telecommunications system. They're going to build an educational system. They're going to build a welfare state for its population and a modern military with U.S. backing and support. In fact, the U.S. are going to have military bases in the region protecting this new state because suddenly Saudi Arabia is going to look a lot more valuable to the rest of the world. Okay. So the Saudis, with American backing, are going to develop a very powerful state. And since the Saudis had already this great legitimacy with this population as a traditional monarchy with a traditional religious population, they're going to build a very popular state, but in a very different way from Turkey. Because the security of the state is going to be heavily dependent on oil revenue and the United States. And unlike Turkey, there's going to be no industrialization here. In fact, their educational system is still very traditional in nature. It's based on rote memorization. It preaches conservative values. It doesn't teach critical thinking skills. It mixes religion and politics. Men and women are segregated. They go to different schools in the country. It promotes patriarchy, and there is no emphasis on industry here, right? It's an oil-dependent economy. So whereas Turkey is going to develop this diversified economy with lots of industry, they're going to export, television sets to Europe. They're going to export manufactured goods. This is not going to be the case with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is not going to have industry at all. And it's not in the interest of the Saudi monarchy to promote a modern educational system or industry. Why do so? For Saudi Arabia, its legitimacy is based on traditional religious values, having a traditional monarchy. So here, let's just take a quick look at this map here. This is a map of Saudi Arabia's oil industry. As you can see here, most of the oil is located in the northeastern part of the country, in the Hassa and Qatif region, and in the Persian Gulf. They have built pipelines that that can send their oil through Jordan into Israel, into the Mediterranean Sea. They also have pipelines that extend out into the Red Sea here. And a lot of oil tankers then take this oil through the Suez Canal, through Egypt, into the Mediterranean. Most of the buyers of this oil are found in Europe today. And some of this oil as well is taken through the Persian Gulf by oil tankers into the Red Sea and then through the Suez Canal. So this is why, by the way, the Persian Gulf is so strategically important. Half of the world's oil resources are located there today. And Saudi Arabia, as a result, is going to experience extensive economic growth, but one that is not based on industrialization or developing a modern educational system. Instead, it's one that's just based on oil revenue. So just like Turkey, approximately the average person earns about $25,000 a year, relatively wealthy. So Turkey and Saudi Arabia, both wealthy countries for different reasons with relatively stable states, very different from Iraq, countries like Syria today. So we're going to see the development of, this kind of modern state here, but one that's based on oil revenue. So just to recap here with Saudi Arabia, it is an oil-dependent monarchy that still has Sharia law. Right. So religious law is still enforced. In fact, it's illegal to convert from Islam. You cannot preach another faith in Saudi Arabia. No opposition is allowed to the state. So there's very little social movement activity in Saudi Arabia. But despite this, despite the high degree of repression, it's a monarchy. It's very stable because there's a lot of oil revenue and a small population. And this means that the population is relatively satisfied. And in this country, traditional religious values are seen as legitimate. Right, because of the traditional nature of the education system, the fact that it never experienced a Tanzimat, a period of defensive development. So we get these traditional religious values here, and thus the monarchy has legitimacy. And Salafism, that is known as Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia, dominates the political culture and the educational system. Very traditional values. And women lacked basic rights until the early 20th century. Now, I'm going to talk a little later in the semester how this is starting to very, very slowly change, but Saudi Arabia is still far behind many of its neighbors within the region. And of course, paradoxically, its biggest ally is the United States, right? So American military presence is extensive in the Arab Gulf today. And so there is this kind of quid pro quo relationship here between these two countries. And in many ways, this has also created some tension with the Wahhabi ulama. Some of those who are farthest to the right have a bit of a problem with this alliance because, after all, the United States is a Western democracy. But for the monarchy, they see it as strategically necessary. And a lot of the Wahhabi ulama have come to kind of tolerate this agreement because it does give the Saudi monarchy stability and allows the Wahhabi ulama to preach their rhetoric. Now, I just like this chart here, by the way. I told you I was going to show you a picture of what these different Islamic headdresses look like. So, in Turkey, 32% of women don't wear any Islamic headdress. And so wearing no headdress for a Muslim is a sign that you are secular, often a sign that you're a feminist, and that you're more, in favor of equality between men and women. Now, each of these different types of dresses, though, as you can see, get more and more conservative and cover more and more of the woman's face. And so the far end of the spectrum here is the burqa. The burqa, women are completely covered. There is this mask over the face where you can't see through it, but the women can see through it, completely covering the woman. And the niqab, slightly less conservative, but still very conservative. You can only see the woman's eyes. And as you can see here in Saudi Arabia, 74% of women wear either a burqa or a niqab, a heavy percentage. In fact, all women have to at least wear the hijab in society. So only Westerners living, in their kind of gated communities and compounds can go outside without a headdress on. So you can see here, just about everybody, every woman in Saudi Arabia has to wear a headdress today. Now, in contrast, if you go to Turkey, you could see here that 32% of women don't wear a headdress at all. And a lot of women either wear the almira or the hijab, which show which show the face. You can see the woman's face there. In fact, with a lot of women wear the hijab so that they actually show some of their hair sometimes as well. So now in contrast, the chador, has complete coverings of the hair, a little bit more conservative. But as you can see here, with these style of headdresses, you could actually see the woman's face. And by the way, there are some feminists that choose to wear the hijab. So I think this is kind of a misconception. So, it is a traditional form of headdress, but one in which, it's easy to interact with the woman. It's more open, right? You feel like you could still approach this person and talk. Whereas with the niqab, there's this kind of hands-off kind of thing, right? And in Saudi Arabia, you have to go out with a niqab if you're a woman. And so it's interesting just looking at the percentages here. You could learn a lot about these different countries and women's rights and attitudes towards them by just looking. And it also shows the great diversity across this region. We can see here countries like Tunisia, Turkey, Lebanon, very forward thinking when it comes to women's rights, whereas Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, it's been struggling more in this regards. And it's interesting just looking at these two pictures here. Here in Turkey, we've got a women's feminist protest here, women without wearing the hijab here, and some dressed in a very provocative way. Whereas on the left, we have here Saudi Arabia, women wearing the niqab, and notice men as well also dress very conservatively. wearing the gelabia, wearing the conservative headdress as well. Okay, so that does it for my lecture. Hopefully, what you learned from this lecture is A, not all states in the Middle East are weak, like Iraq and Syria. Number two, not all states in the Middle East are conservative when it comes to religious values. Turkey has become a very progressive country, relatively speaking. Although we'll talk a little later in the semester how Islamism has been making a comeback in recent years. And also, as well, I think what this shows is that it's not just the Europeans that shape borders in the region, it's also indigenous forces. Okay, so that does it for my lecture. Okay, I'll see you guys next time.